It is so good to see you. Before I jump in, I just want to tell you about something I'm really excited about, and that's that next Sunday, November the 3rd, we're going to be sharing with you an exciting update about our Promise campaign, which we haven't done in a while. So if you haven't been here for a while, you're not sure what I'm talking about. Back in 2017, we unveiled this vision that we called the Promise that included building our children's building, moving the cabin, buying a lot of property around us to sort of prepare for future growth. And so over the years, we've continued to dream while continuing to pay down that debt. And next Sunday, we're going to share an exciting update about where we are with all of that and hint a little bit of what we're thinking about in the future. So I hope you'll be back next Sunday. It's going to be a really exciting time and a good time. And we're going to sort of take a trip down memory lane, but also prepare for the future a little bit. So next Sunday, make sure you're here, and it's going to be a fun time. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Mark chapter 12, and while you're turning there, I have a picture I want to show you. This is Mackenzie Scott. She is the ex-wife and former business partner of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. When they divorced in 2019, as a part of the settlement, she was given 4% of Amazon's stock, which at that point equaled $38 billion. She became the third richest woman in America. And since then, she's sort of become this full-time philanthropist. Earlier this year, in March, on one single day, she gave away $640 million over a 24-hour period. When you add that to the other money she's given away, she's already given away $17.3 billion, which equals more than 50% of her net worth. The people who study this kind of thing, researchers say, she's giving away her fortune faster than anybody in history. It already equals more than 50%. Just a couple weeks ago, there was an article in the paper, you may have seen this. Her foundation was giving grants, and they picked out a small business in South Georgia that helps low-income entrepreneurs sort of get their business off the ground. They sort of provide the funding for that. And her foundation had granted them $10 million. But when they tried to get in touch with him, the guy thought it was a scam and refused to accept the money. So next time you get one of those weird phone calls, you don't recognize the number, like you might want to answer, because she might be calling to give you $10 million. In the article in the paper, one of the writers said, Miss Scott is an example of unprecedented philanthropy fueled by game-changing generosity. Now, if you're anything like me, whenever you hear a story like that, you automatically assume, like, if I had that kind of money, then I would do the same thing. Now, there may not be like a shred of evidence to suggest that's true. But all of us have sort of convinced ourselves that if we just, if I was just a billionaire, then I would be generous like other people. Most people see themselves as generous people. It's just that, we lack the resources to be as generous as we would really like to be. But if we had the opportunity, almost all of us are convinced that we would be just as generous as the people we hear about. I heard a story this week about a guy who went into a bank and he said he wanted to open a joint account. And the teller asked him, who do you want to open it with? And he said, anybody that has a lot of money. And that's kind of the way it is. Like, we just convince ourselves that if we just had access to more money, that would solve all of our problems, and we would finally get to be the generous people that deep down inside we believe we are. But here's the question. Is that true? Is it true that if we just had more money, that we would give more money? Is it true that if we had access to more resources, we would finally be the kind of people that most of us believe ourselves to be? So in Mark chapter 12, there's this incredible story that we're going to look at. We've been in this series called The Journey to Generosity. We're going to finish up today by looking at what's the last scene from what's called Jesus' public ministry. It took place during near the beginning of the Passover week, which, if you know the rest of the story, turned out to be the last week of Jesus' life. And just to set the context of what we're about to read, the Passover was one of 3 Jewish festivals that every Jewish person, and especially Jewish men, were expected or really required to celebrate inside the city of Jerusalem. So people would travel from all over the world to be a part of this as they remembered what God had done for their ancestors when he freed them from Egyptian slavery. And because of the people traveling all over the place, the population of Jerusalem would swell from somewhere around 30,000 up to maybe 175,000. And so all these people are coming. And as a part of their observance of the Passover, every visitor to Jerusalem during their visit was expected to visit the temple, which was sort of the epicenter of Jewish life, and drop in a donation or a financial offering to support the work of the temple. So they would go to the temple, and out in what was called the Court of Women, there was this area called the temple treasury. I've got a picture of what it kind of looked like. And inside that treasury, there were 13 of these like trumpet-shaped bronze donation boxes. And each of those donation boxes would have a different label on it. So it's kind of like designated giving, right? So you would go, and if you wanted to give to the building fund, there was a trumpet-marked building fund. You go up and drop in your offering. The other one was, if you wanted to give to buy more animals to be sacrificed, there was a box you could go. So they would go through, and this was a part of how they worship. They would come, they would save up all year, then they would go to these different donation boxes, and they would drop in their offering. And so as Mark 12 opens, Jesus is in the temple treasury. He's sort of posted up opposite where all of these donation boxes are located, and he's just sort of casually watching as one person after another comes in and gives their offering. Mark chapter 12, verse 41. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. Now, in today's culture, most of you give online, or maybe you quietly slip a check into the offering boxes in the lobby. But in those days, giving had become sort of a production. And so because their money was made out of metal, they come in, they carry these bags, you can hear them sort of clanging together, and then we get to those donation boxes, and because they're made of bronze, every time you dropped a coin down in that box, what would happen is it would echo, it would reverberate around that hall. That's why Mark says there were a lot of rich people giving large donations, and he knew that because he could hear it. And so everybody would watch, and some rich person would go up and they'd dump their coins in that thing and make all kinds of noise. And everybody's sort of sitting back watching. Today, this would be the equivalent of if every time you gave an offering, you had somebody video you putting it in the box, or hitting deposit on your phone so that you could turn it into an Instagram story or a TikTok video, with hashtag generosity. This is what everybody's sort of watching. Everybody's seeing what everybody else is putting in. And it's become a sort of a production. Now, let me stop here just a second and point out one of the dangerous myths that a lot of people have bought into when it comes to giving, and it's this. It's the amount that counts. It's the amount that counts. That's what a lot of people believe. If you were to go back in time, if we had like a time machine, and you could go back to this particular day and sit there with Jesus, you would find that he was not the only person watching. Like there were a lot of people there, and they were all watching to see what everybody else was putting in. And if somebody came through and they put in, an especially large amount, everybody would sort of sit back and they would ooh and they would ah, because there's something about a large gift. There's something about a large donation that draws attention. In our culture, we believe that large gifts should be celebrated. That's why if you go home today and you Google Mackenzie Scott, the first several articles that'll come up will be about her giving to all these different nonprofits. In our world, we believe that anybody that gives, over and above deserves to be recognized and deserves to be celebrated. And that's because most of us have bought into this myth that it's the amount that counts. So yeah, it's good to give $1, but it's better to give $10. And if you can give $100, that's better. And anybody that can give $1,000 or even $10,000 deserves to be celebrated. We almost always assume that the person who gives $10,000 is more generous than the person who gives $10. That's because we've bought into this idea that it's all about the amount, and the amount is what counts. But when you get to verse 42 in this passage in Mark 12, Jesus does something that sort of turns that kind of thinking up on its head. I want you to look at this with me, verse 42. But a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Now, honestly, this is the kind of offering that very few people who were in that lobby that day would have even noticed. The copper coins this woman dropped in the box were not even really coins like we would think of coins. The Greek word that Mark used indicates they were more like metal shavings. These are like the edges of a coin. One historian said that the time it would have taken to count the value of these 2 coins was worth more than the value of the 2 coins. Like this is like you see like half a penny on the ground, you're not even sure, you just like bend over and pick it up, right? Like this was worth nothing. Compared to everything else that had been dropped in the donation boxes that day, this was an embarrassingly small offering. Some of you remember back, prehistoric times in churches, we used to pass the offering plate. You remember that? And depending on what kind of church you went to, they might pass it like 2 or 3 times in one service. We're just going to keep passing until we get what we want. And the unwritten assumption with that was that when it's passed, like you should give. Well, this would be like if you had a penny that had been run over by a train and defaced and bent up and you're not even sure it's worth anything. This would be like if you dropped that penny in the offering plate. Like nobody's even sure this is worth anything. And yet Jesus watches this poor widow, and even though what she's given is not worth almost anything from an earthly perspective, you get to verse 43, and Jesus does something that's really hard to understand. Check this out. Verse 43, calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on. A couple weeks ago, it was late in the afternoon, and Cannon, my 9-year-old son, who's in 3rd grade, was working on his homework, and he asked me if I would check his homework, like before he turned it in on Friday. And so I sat down at the table, and I learned something. I didn't realize that math in 2024 is a lot different than it was in 1994. Like, I had no idea. I don't know how I missed that, but he was showing me this. I had no idea. It looked like like Egyptian hieroglyphics or something. Just no idea what I was looking at. But I didn't want him to know that, right? And so I see the 10 or 11 problems, whatever he's got, and I pulled out my pen, and in my head, I'm doing the problems the old way, or what I would lovingly refer to as like the right way. You know what I mean? So I'm showing, and I'm going through, and I'm saying things like, yes, interesting, good, yes, trying to make him think. And I get and I realize there's 2 on here that he missed. And so I pointed out to him, and he said, Dad, could you show me where I missed these, like in the steps? And I knew at that point, like, the gig was up, right? So I did what anybody would have done. I pretended my phone was ringing. And I said, you'll have to get your mom to help you because I don't have time to fool with this. But, like, the new math is different, right? And when you read what Jesus said in verse 43, you realize that Jesus is using some new math. Like when he says that this woman gave these 2 like metal shavings, they're like 2 fractions of a coin, and Jesus says that what she gave is more than what everybody else gave. And you begin to think, like, I'm not sure Jesus understands what more means. Like, what is more? More is more. But Jesus says that less is more. And he says that somehow, from his perspective, what this lady just gave, these 2 metal shavings, like the edges of a coin, somehow equal more than all those bags of coins that everybody else had poured into the offering. I mean, from an economics perspective, this makes no sense. I mean, if it's truly the amount that counts, I mean, if that's what counts, then what this woman just did didn't amount to hardly anything. And yet Jesus said that what she did was more than what everybody else did. He says, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. And if what he said is true, that means that the way God does math is different than the way most of us do math. It's a lot different than what most people in our culture think, too. N.T. Wright said it this way. He said, God's way of measuring reality is not our way. So here's the truth about giving when it comes to generosity. Jesus is more focused on the sacrifice than he is the sum. The reason that what Jesus said in verse 43 makes sense is because of what he follows it up with in verse 44. See, the reason he could say that this woman gave more is because everybody else gave out of what they had left over. I mean, they were wealthy people. They had access to a lot of resources. All of their bills were paid, and so they took a percentage of what they had left over, and they took it to the temple. But Jesus said this woman, when she showed up, she didn't have anything left. She gave out of her poverty. She gave everything she had, not everything she had left. And those are two different things. That's why at the end of that, he says she gave out of her poverty, and then just to make sure we don't miss the point, he added all she had to give on. So the wealthy people, like, they gave more in terms of a sum, but she gave more in terms of a sacrifice. Now, why would she do that? Why would somebody give more than they can afford to give? I think it's because of something Jesus said in Matthew 6 when he said, no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then he says, you cannot serve both God and money. All throughout the New Testament, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, Jesus talks more about money, more about our attitude towards our possessions than any other topic, including heaven and hell. And it's almost always framed as a test or an exam. And he says that the way you approach your possessions, the way you think about money is a test. And it may be the most important test of your life because it's the one test that all of us continually have to retake. So again, whenever you look at the New Testament never says it's wrong to have money, never even indicates it's wrong to have a lot of money. But it does say that the way you feel about your money and the way you approach your money reveals a lot about your heart. And let's just be honest, what it reveals about most of us is not all that positive sometimes. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Over the years, there have been multiple studies that have found that the more a person's income goes up, the more the percentage of their giving goes down. There's like this inverse relationship. It's hard to figure out. And while it's true that like the amount may be more, the percentage of their giving actually goes down. And why would that be? Let me give you an example. So one of the things that was deeply ingrained in me as a kid, and maybe in some of you too, was this idea of tithing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the idea that whatever you earn, you automatically give the first 10% back to God. So whenever I got my first job at the age of 14, it was deeply ingrained. Here's what we do. You get paid, you figure out what 10% is, and you write that check back to the Lord. And that's a habit that stuck with me throughout the years, and I know many of you do that too. But here's the thing. Like when you're 14 years old and you make minimum wage and you're bringing home $150 a week, 10% is about $15, right? It's not that hard to write a check for $15 and give it back to the church. I mean, that's like a value meal at Wendy's, you know. Now, when I was 14, that was 2 or 3 value meals, but now it's like one. So, I mean, that doesn't sting that much. You know, you can kind of write that check, no big deal. But let's say you do well in your career, you climb the ladder, and suddenly you're making more money. Now you're making, let's just say, $75,000 a year. That means you're making $1,400 a week, and 10% of $1,400 a week is $140. And that's a little bit harder to write that check. I mean, you can't get much of $15, but if you got $140, you can buy some stuff with that, right? And besides, you write that check, and then you're thinking, man, I got kids, and I want to retire someday, and my house payment, and everybody has to have a new iPhone. I mean, you're thinking, well, you can buy some stuff with 100. So whenever you write that check, it starts to sting a little bit. And so here's what we do. Because it stings, we start to back off. Or let's say that you've done like super well in your career, and now you make $250,000 a year. 10% of $250,000 is $25,000, which if you do the math, equals a little more than $2,000 a month. Now you're talking about some real money. $2,000 a month, you can buy a lot of stuff. That's a mortgage payment on a vacation house. That's a boat payment on a really nice boat. You can buy a top of the line, luxury automobile. And now, man, $2,000 is a lot. And so what happens is, as our income goes up, our percentage of giving normally goes down. Because all of a sudden, you're being asked to write some checks that sting a little bit. That's why Mother Teresa, she called that the paradox of giving. She said, the more you have, the less you can give. The less you have, the more you can give. She's talking about percentages. So how do you guard against that happening to you? How do you guard against your possessions and your attitude towards money taking over? As we finish this series, I want to give you 3 really practical things that may help you. So if you're keeping track, here's the first one. If you want to keep this from happening to you, it requires planned giving. Planned giving. So there's a famous writer named Ron Blue. He was a CPA and wrote a great book titled Master Your Money. And in his book, he said there are really only 5 things that a person can do with money. So we're going to put these on the screen just so you can see them. You can spend it, you can repay your debt, you can pay your taxes, you can save it, or you can give it away. And as you look at his list, what's interesting about this is that's pretty much the order most of us operate under, right? So we get money, what do? We spend it on ourselves, we repay the debt that we accumulated serving ourselves, we pay our taxes, we save it in order to secure our financial future, and then if there's anything left over, we give it away. I mean, let's just be honest, most of us are a lot like the people that Jesus described early on in this story. We give out of what we have left, if we have anything left. But what's so interesting about this list, if you really break it down, I've thought a lot about this, is almost all of this is about you, or it's about me. So just hang with me. So who do we spend money on? Well, I spend money on me. All right, I repay debt on the money I borrowed to make my life easier. I pay my taxes so that I can stay out of prison. I save money so that I can have a better future. And then if there's anything left, I'll worry about helping others. So it's like me, others. And that's the way most of us operate. But if you want to cultivate a generous heart, you have to reprioritize. You have to flip that script. And the only way to do that is to have a real plan. Having a plan for what I'm going to give, what I'm going to give to, and how much I'm going to give frees me to support the things that I think are most important, while at the same time it helps me know what I don't need to give to. So I said this last week. Some of you had this experience. Almost every day, somebody asks me for money, or some organization asks me for money. And knowing what I'm going to give to in advance, having a plan for how I'm going to give, helps me to say no to some good things so that I can say yes to what I think are some better things. And so if I'm fired up about teen pregnancies, I can give to the pregnancy center. I have a plan to give, which means I'm going to say no to some other things that, while they might be important, might not be as important as the thing I'm giving to. Here's the second thing. Not only do you have to have planned giving, you have to have proactive giving. Now, most of us are really good at reactive giving or spontaneous giving. So here's what I mean. Hurricane blows through and somebody needs help with supplies, and we're all really good. Like, we don't mind taking our wallet out, pulling out a few dollars, and trying to help as much as we can. That's an example of reactive giving. But if you want to take your generosity to the next level, you have to identify some things that you think are important. Again, the pregnancy center, the Gideons. Maybe you pick out some missionary and you say, I'm going to give a portion every month to support what these people are doing, because what these people are doing is really important. If you're a follower of Jesus, I think it's clear when you read through the New Testament that the church should be a part of your giving plan. Maybe it's not all you give to, but it should be a part of the plan. And so I want to invest in the things that I think are honoring God and helping people. And as I do that, I'm not just going to do it reactively. I'm not just going to do it spontaneously. I'm going to do it monthly, weekly, proactively, so that I become a person that doesn't just occasionally do generous things, but now I'm an actual generous person, because I'm not waiting for the things to come to me. I'm looking for things I can invest in. And then here's the last thing. If you want to cultivate a generous heart, you have to engage in percentage giving. One of the questions that always comes up, I had this conversation just this week. People say, what percentage of my income should I give away? So I told you earlier, for me, it started at 10%. Today, it's more. And the reason I tell you that is I'm not going to ask you to do something that I don't do. Like, I really believe that what Jesus said about the way you handle your money is true. And so that's something that we try to do in our lives. And so we started at 10, now we give more. If you're not there, maybe you could start at 3% and work your way up to 10%. And I know some of you hear that and you immediately think, there is no way that I could ever give 10% of my income away. Some people believe that. And I'm just telling you, what you're forgetting about is that when you do that, as we talked about last week, God promises to bless that 90% that remains in a way that makes it possible that it continues to grow so that you never miss the 10%. One of my favorite preachers, Bob Russell, who many of you know, Southeast Christian Church, I was listening to one of his sermons one time, and he was talking about this very thing. And he told his church in Louisville, he said, we believe this so much that if you commit to giving 10% of your income to the church, if you do it for 1 year, if you get to the end of the year and you find that you need that money back, we will write you a check for every dollar you gave to us. They called it money back guaranteed tithing. I'm going to make you the same deal. If you commit to 1 year to tithing and you get to the end of that year and you feel like you need your money back, Bob Russell and Southeast Christian will give you your money back. If you can find them, like if you can get in touch with them, they'll write you a check. How much should you give? Here's what C.S. Lewis had to say. He has a great quote. He said, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid, listen to this, I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things we would like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditures exclude them. Exactly what Jesus was talking about in Mark chapter 12. The first group that came through, all these wealthy people, they gave out of what they had left. So it didn't really affect them. But then this poor widow comes in. And she gives everything in a way that stung, in a way that pinched. I want to tell you about what might be the largest single offering that was ever given at our church. And I know that's a big statement because our church has been around for a long time. And there are a lot of people who have been really generous. But there's one offering that whenever I think about this topic, I can't help but think about. And the reason is I had a front row seat, literally sitting right here, and I saw it happen with my own eyes. I'm going to show you a picture. We've got a Christmas offering we do. Some of you have been around a while. You'll recognize this. You see the manger in the middle there? We always set that up. And we have this Christmas offering every year, and a big percentage of what we take in goes out to support our mission partners around the world. But we always bring this manger out, and I don't know who started this. It's been going on a long time. And so there's this point in the service when we do this that people like to come up and drop their offering in the manger. Now, you don't have to do it that way. I mean, there's lots of ways to give, and you've got an insert in your bulletin that tells you a lot of those ways. But some people like to do that as a family, kind of a symbolic thing, and it's become a tradition. So we're in this Christmas service, and the manger is up here, and I almost brought it out, but I thought I'd freak everybody out and think it's rushing to Christmas. So it's sitting right here, and so I got to back up. There was this guy that started coming to our church. His name was Larry. Now, Larry's dead now, so I can tell this story. Some of you remember him. I had met Larry out at some community events, and all of a sudden he started showing up at church. And some of you remember him, Larry looked like a guy that was transported from the 1960s like to now. He had kind of the old school kind of hippie look. You know what I mean? Long white hair, kind of a long, scraggly white beard. Sometimes he wore a bandana. It was like Willie Nelson come to life. You know what I mean? So Larry started showing up. The other thing to know about Larry, though, is that Larry was homeless. Larry lived in a van. And so if you traveled around our community during the week, you would see his van parked at different points all throughout the community. And so Larry started coming to church, and sometimes he'd pull up in the parking lot, and you'd see him, and I don't know how he lived in this van, because he would open the door, and stuff would fall out. You know what I mean? There was so much stuff in that van. And we tried to help him at different times, but he was just content with the way things were. But Larry, admittedly, was not the easiest guy to connect with. He was really hard of hearing, so sometimes you'd talk to him, and he didn't catch what you were saying. And just quite honestly, because he lived in a van, his hygiene practices were not always the best. And sometimes it was hard to get too close to Larry. But he liked coming here because the people were nice to him, and if we had a meal or something, the ladies would always, load him down, and he'd take it home with him or to the van, and he'd eat for a couple days. We're having this Christmas service one day, and everybody's had to start the song, and everybody's coming up, and they're giving their offering. And there was this big line down this way, and I'm sitting right here, and I let it clear out for a minute, and I brought up, and I think Canaan was with me, and we dropped ours in, and we went back and sat, and then I looked, and Larry's coming down the aisle. And I was a little bit nervous because I wasn't sure he realized what we were doing because he couldn't hear. I wasn't sure, but he came up, and he's kind of looking around, kind of had this, look on his face, and he stops right in front of this manger, and he digs way down in his pocket. Just way down, and he finds this crumpled up dollar and a handful of change, and he puts it in the manger. Now, I'm telling you, I've seen a lot of offering, and I know we took up several $1,000s that day. But there's nobody that made a greater sacrifice than he did. There's nobody in this building that gave more than he did that day. We all gave what we had left. And I'm pretty sure that he gave everything he had in his pocket. And you say, I don't know who gave the greatest offering. If you believe what Jesus said, sometimes less is more. Sometimes it's not the amount, it's the sacrifice. Because Jesus isn't all that worried about the raw numbers. He's worried about what it means for your heart. So one thing that's always struck me about this story is that at no point in this, Jesus is posted up. He sees what's happening, and Jesus doesn't stop this lady. And you would think, all right, Jesus, you realize this is all this lady has. Why didn't he stop her? Why didn't he say to her, hey, I know you're getting ready to do this, but we got some other wealthy people that can pick up the slack. Don't worry about it. He doesn't do that. You know why he didn't do that? Because Jesus knows how it works. Luke chapter 12, Jesus said this, give and it'll be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. May not always come the way you expect it, may not always be financial, but the promise is whatever you give, you get back tenfold. I want you to stand with me. We're going to have just a brief invitation. If you're here this morning and you've never made that first step, I want you to know, God's worried about your money, but he's more worried about your heart. And he says if you'll give him your heart, your money will follow. So if you're here and you've never given Christ your heart, you never put your trust in him, we'd be honored to help you do that. If you're ready to join the team here at First Christian, if you're ready to be baptized into Christ, we'd be honored to help you. Whatever you need to do, meet us on this front row.